There is something strange about the power system in Avatar, The Last Airbender. For most of the original series, power actually makes sense. Characters train. They struggle. They lose fights. They learn new techniques. And when someone becomes stronger, you can usually understand why. Then we get to the final battle between Aang and Ozai, and suddenly, all of that careful progression leads to one terrifying realization: the Avatar state is ridiculously powerful. And that creates a problem. Because once you've shown your protagonist possessing a power this overwhelming, how do you continue the franchise without making every future fight feel pointless? That's where Avatar's power system starts becoming complicated. And the crazy part is, the original series didn't actually have a broken power system. It had almost the opposite. It had one of the most carefully designed combat systems in animation. So today, we're going to break down exactly how Avatar's power system works, why the original series handled it so well, and how the Avatar state eventually became a problem for everything that came after. First, we need to understand why Avatar's bending works so well. At its core, Avatar has four primary bending arts: water, earth, fire, and air. Most people can only bend one of them. The Avatar is the exception. That's the foundation of the entire world. But bending isn't simply a collection of magical superpowers. That's what makes it so interesting. Each element has its own philosophy, movement, combat style, and limitations. Water is about adaptation and flow. Earth is about stability and power. Fire is connected to energy and the ability to generate force. And air is built around movement, freedom, and evasion. These aren't just cool ideas attached to different colored attacks. They actually influence how characters fight. That's why watching Aang learn earthbending is so satisfying. He can't simply watch Toph throw a rock and immediately become an expert. His entire mindset has to change. Aang is naturally evasive. He survives by moving. He avoids direct confrontation. But earthbending demands almost the opposite. When Toph tells him to stand his ground, Aang struggles because the problem isn't his physical ability. It's his mentality. And that's something Avatar does incredibly well. Getting stronger isn't just about unlocking a new transformation. It's about becoming a better bender. Look at Katara. At the beginning of the series, she can barely control a small amount of water. But over time, she develops more precise techniques. She learns how to manipulate larger quantities of water. She becomes a more intelligent fighter. And eventually, she develops techniques that most ordinary waterbenders couldn't even dream of. Her growth feels believable because we actually watch it happen. The same thing happens with Zuko. His firebending isn't simply about producing bigger flames. His entire relationship with fire changes as his character changes. At first, his fire is fueled by anger and obsession. Later, after losing that source of motivation, he struggles to bend at the same level. Then he discovers a completely different source of fire. That's brilliant power system storytelling. Because the character's emotional development affects his abilities. And that's one of the reasons Avatar feels different from many other fantasy series. The characters aren't simply collecting powers. They're learning how to understand themselves. Then there are the special techniques. Metal bending. Lightning generation. Lightning redirection. Blood bending. Healing. Lava bending. Energy bending. Each one expands the system without completely replacing the original rules. And that's important. Because a good power system needs limitations. If anyone can suddenly learn anything, whenever the story needs it, then the rules stop meaning anything. Avatar usually avoids that. Rare abilities are connected to specific skills, circumstances, philosophies, or levels of mastery. Even environmental advantages can matter. Waterbending, for example, is strongly influenced by access to water and lunar conditions, with the full moon providing a major advantage. So when a character becomes stronger, you can usually point to a reason. Training, experience, environment, technique, or mindset. And then, we reach Aang. Because Aang isn't just another bender. He's the Avatar. And that means the rules suddenly change. The Avatar can master all 4 elements. But the truly terrifying part isn't simply having 4 types of bending. It's the Avatar state. Throughout the series, we get small glimpses of what Aang is capable of when he enters it. And every time it happens, the difference is enormous. Suddenly, Aang isn't fighting like a 12-year-old who has spent months learning 4 different disciplines. He's tapping into something far greater. Something connected to the Avatar cycle itself. And that creates the biggest power gap in the entire series. Because when Aang finally enters the Avatar state during his battle with Ozai, Ozai has the advantage of the Sozin's comet. His firebending has been massively amplified. He is one of the most powerful firebenders alive. And yet, once Aang fully takes control of the Avatar state, the fight changes completely. And that's where the real question begins. If Aang has access to this much power, why did he spend the entire series struggling to defeat his enemies? The answer is actually more complicated than you might think. And understanding that answer is the key to understanding why Avatar's power system eventually became such a difficult problem for the franchise. Because the Avatar state wasn't the problem. The problem was what came after it.
The Avatar state is where everything changes. During most of The Last Airbender, Aang's biggest challenge is becoming strong enough to defeat the Fire Lord. He has to learn waterbending, earthbending, firebending, and eventually airbending at a level that allows him to face the strongest firebender in the world. But there is one problem: Aang already possesses something that completely breaks the normal rules of progression. The Avatar state. We see glimpses of its power throughout the series. When Aang loses control, his bending suddenly operates on an entirely different level. He can create enormous waves, massive air currents, devastating attacks, and manipulate multiple elements with incredible speed. But there is an important limitation. Aang doesn't fully control it. In fact, that's what makes it so dangerous. Roku explains that the Avatar state gives Aang enormous power, but it also creates an enormous vulnerability. If Aang dies while in the Avatar state, the Avatar cycle ends. So this isn't supposed to be a transformation that Aang can casually activate whenever he wants. It's a power with a serious cost. And that limitation is extremely important because it prevents the Avatar state from destroying the entire power system. Aang spends much of the series trying to understand it, control it, and eventually master it. At the end of Book 2, he finally begins to enter the Avatar state consciously. Then Azula interrupts the process with lightning, leaving Aang unable to access it normally. And throughout most of Book 3, we don't see Aang casually using the full Avatar state to solve every problem. That's actually a smart decision. Because if Aang could simply activate his strongest form whenever he wanted, most conflicts would immediately become meaningless. Imagine Zuko challenging Aang to a duel. Aang enters the Avatar state. Fight over. Imagine Azula attacking Team Avatar. Avatar state. Fight over. Imagine the Fire Nation sending an army. Avatar state. Problem solved. That would destroy the tension. So the original series saves the full power of the Avatar state for the moment when everything else has failed. And that moment arrives during the final battle against Ozai. Aang has tried to defeat Ozai without killing him. Ozai has the power of Sozin's comet behind him, making his firebending stronger than ever. Aang is cornered, and for a moment, it looks like there is absolutely no way he can win. Then something changes. Aang finally enters the Avatar state completely. And suddenly, the power difference becomes ridiculous. The fight stops feeling like a battle between two masters and starts feeling like Ozai is trying to survive a natural disaster. Aang controls all four elements with incredible speed. Massive waves of earth rise around him. Air surrounds him. Fire erupts from multiple directions. Water, earth, fire, and air become one continuous attack. Ozai, who was previously dominating the battlefield, can barely keep up. He runs. He dodges. He tries to escape. But he can't even touch Aang. And this is where people sometimes misunderstand the original power system. The problem isn't that Aang suddenly became too strong. The story had been building toward this moment for 3 seasons. The Avatar state was always supposed to represent the accumulated power and knowledge of the Avatar cycle. The real problem is that the original series was designed to end here. Aang defeats Ozai. The war ends. The story reaches its conclusion. And the strongest version of the Avatar is finally revealed during the final minutes of the story. There doesn't need to be another season where Aang fights someone even stronger than Ozai. There doesn't need to be another villain who can casually overpower the Avatar state. The writers didn't need to ask, how do we make Aang stronger next year? Because there was no next year. That's why the power system works so well in the original series. The ceiling is established at the exact moment the story ends. But then Avatar became bigger. The world continued. A new Avatar appeared. A new series began. And suddenly, the writers had a massive problem. Because Korra wasn't starting from zero. She was already an incredibly powerful bender. She could bend 3 elements before she even learned airbending. She eventually mastered all 4. And sooner or later, the story would have to deal with the Avatar state again. But how do you create tension when your main character already possesses the ultimate power-up? You can't keep introducing stronger and stronger villains forever. Eventually, you're going to end up with Avatar characters fighting like Dragon Ball characters, where every new villain has to be more powerful than the previous one just to create tension. So the Legend of Korra had to find another solution. And this is where the power system starts changing in a major way. Because instead of simply making the villain stronger, the franchise began changing what the Avatar state actually meant. And that decision would have consequences that we can still see in Avatar today. And this is where the real problem begins. The Legend of Korra had to continue the Avatar story without simply repeating Aang's journey. Korra couldn't spend 4 seasons learning the 4 elements from scratch, because she was already an experienced bender before the series even started. So the writers had to find a different way to create conflict. Instead of making Korra's journey about learning the basic elements, the story focused much more on spirituality, identity, politics, and the consequences of being the Avatar. And for a while, this actually worked incredibly well. In the first season, Korra struggles with airbending and with her spiritual connection. The Avatar state isn't constantly used as an instant solution to every problem. This keeps the fights interesting because Korra still has limitations. But then Book 2 changes everything. Korra becomes involved in a conflict between the physical and spirit worlds, and eventually the connection between the Avatar and her past lives is destroyed. This is one of the biggest changes to the Avatar mythology in the entire franchise. Before this point, the Avatar state wasn't simply a temporary boost of energy. It represented something much bigger. Aang could draw upon the knowledge and experience of countless previous avatars. The Avatar state was connected to the entire history of the Avatar cycle. After Korra loses that connection, the meaning of the Avatar state changes. It can still massively increase her bending power, but something fundamental has been lost. And from a storytelling perspective, you can understand why the writers made this decision. They couldn't keep using the exact same power system forever. If every avatar had access to the combined knowledge and experience of hundreds of previous lives, then eventually every new avatar would become almost impossible to challenge. But the way this change was introduced created another problem. The audience had already seen what the avatar state could do. We had watched Aang move enormous amounts of earth, water, fire, and air. We had watched him overwhelm Ozai while the Fire Lord was empowered by Sozin's comet. So when the avatar state later feels more like a temporary combat boost, the difference is noticeable. It feels like the ceiling has been lowered. And that's where the franchise starts running into a power scaling problem. Because now the writers have two choices. Either every new villain needs to be stronger than the previous villain, or the avatar needs to become less overwhelmingly powerful. The first option would eventually turn Avatar into a completely different kind of series. Imagine every new enemy needing to be stronger than Ozai, then stronger than that enemy, then stronger than that one. Eventually you would need villains who could challenge the Avatar on a ridiculous scale. And that simply doesn't fit the world Avatar originally created. So the second option makes more sense. The Avatar state becomes something that enhances an already powerful bender instead of automatically turning them into an unstoppable force. And honestly, I think that was probably the only sustainable choice. But then another change happened. The franchise started expanding the abilities of ordinary benders. And this is where things get really interesting. In the original series, advanced bending techniques felt rare. Metal bending was revolutionary. Lightning generation was extremely dangerous and difficult. Blood bending was considered an extraordinary ability. These techniques felt special because they required years of mastery, unusual circumstances, or an exceptionally talented individual. But as the universe expanded, more and more specialized abilities appeared. And that isn't automatically a bad thing. In fact, some of the best abilities in Avatar come from this expansion. The problem happens when almost every major character begins feeling like they have a unique superpower. Suddenly, the difference between an ordinary bender and an elite bender becomes much harder to understand. And that's especially noticeable when we compare the original series with newer Avatar stories. In Aang's story, watching someone master a new technique feels like watching them climb a mountain. You understand how difficult it is. You understand why very few people can do it. You understand why that ability matters. But when new characters suddenly demonstrate extremely advanced bending with very little explanation, the old progression starts to feel less meaningful. This becomes even more obvious when we look at the newer versions of Team Avatar and their enemies. Characters can perform incredibly fast combinations, use bending almost like superhuman martial arts, and sometimes appear to master techniques that would have taken years of training in the original series. Visually, these fights can look incredible. There is no denying that. The animation and choreography can make bending feel faster, sharper, and more cinematic than ever. But visually impressive does not always mean logically consistent. And that's the central issue with Avatar's modern power system. The bending itself isn't broken. The problem is that the rules have become more flexible. And once the rules become flexible, power scaling becomes harder to measure. We no longer always know what the upper limit of a normal bender is. We don't always know how much training a technique requires. And we definitely don't know exactly where the Avatar state sits compared to the strongest individual benders. That's why the Avatar state in newer stories can sometimes feel strangely inconsistent. In one moment, it looks like the ultimate power in the world. In another, it feels like a temporary boost that helps the Avatar compete with characters who shouldn't logically be anywhere near that level. And this brings us back to the biggest question of all. Did Avatar actually break its power system? Or did the franchise simply outgrow the rules that made the original series work so well? Because when you look at the entire history of Avatar, the answer is much more complicated than simply saying, the writers nerfed the Avatar. The original system was designed for a story with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. Once that story ended, the rules had to evolve if the universe was going to continue. And that evolution created the inconsistencies we see today. The Avatar state didn't suddenly become weak. The world around it became bigger. There were more characters, more techniques, more stories, more villains, and more powerful fighters. And the writers had to find a way to keep all of them relevant without making the Avatar completely unstoppable. That may have saved the franchise from endless power escalation, but it also changed something that made the original Avatar feel so special. The question isn't whether the new system is better or worse. The real question is whether Avatar can continue expanding without losing the internal logic that made its original power system so satisfying in the first place. And after seeing how the Avatar state has changed over the years, there's one thing I think is impossible to ignore. The biggest problem with Avatar's power system was never how powerful the Avatar became. It was that the story kept going after the moment when that power system had already reached its natural ending.